My name is Stacy Ashmore Cole. I'm a retired federal civil servant living in Brunswick, Georgia. I'm here today to talk about a project that I started 3 years ago to document the names of African Americans in early Liberty County, Georgia records. I'm going to talk about the gap I was trying to fill through this project, what it includes and makes possible, and tell some stories. My purpose in being here today is hopefully to inspire others, individuals or groups, to do similar things. In 2017, I started researching my family's history. I had retired from the federal government. I was living in Brunswick, where I am now. My sister gave me her Ancestry account. I logged in, and between the records I found there and the research that other cousins had done, I quickly found my father's paternal line in the Liberty County back to the 1750s. I had only to fill in a few gaps. It was quick and easy. You can see here, started with George Ashmore, my father, and ended up with Strong Ashmore, my fifth great-grandfather. This is where Liberty County is in Georgia, not far from Savannah. It was originally comprised of 3 parishes and was named Liberty County after the Revolutionary War because the people there basically dragged Georgia into the war, kicking and screaming. By 1759, my fifth great-grandfather, Strong Ashmore, had been in Georgia for 5 years. He and his son, John Ashmore, my fourth great-grandfather, were members of the oldest church in Liberty County, the Midway Congregational Church, that was attended by both white and black members. The photo on the right is the church as it exists today. That building was built in 1792 after the original building was burned by British soldiers during the Revolutionary War. On the left-hand side, you'll see the church, an older photo of the church, with African American congregants and others gathered outside the little door on the left, which was the entrance to the slave gallery. Black and white congregants attended church at the same time, and they were both considered full members, though obviously the African American members had fewer privileges in the church. The church was established in 1752. This is the interior of the church where the slave gallery was. The church disbanded in 1867. It was taken over by the black parishioners who rented the church building from the Midway Church Society and essentially saved this historic building. At the last annual homecoming, I sat up here in the balcony and watched the service, thinking about all the people who would have sat in that very spot. My second great-grandfather, Joseph Ashmore, turned out to have been the Liberty County probate judge for many years, starting around 1876, and his children followed him into the profession and essentially were the probate judges through the 1930s. So once I put it all together, I was pretty pleased with all that I had found. Then I found the document that changed my life. It was my fourth great-grandfather, John Ashmore's 1841 will, in which he listed 11 enslaved people he was leaving to various family members. Even though intellectually I knew it was likely that my family were slave owners, it was still a shock to see the names. Seeing the names had so much more impact than anything I ever learned in school about slavery. I started to research the 11 people you see named here to see what I could find about their lives. I went to the 1870 census and I found only one of the 11 had taken the family surname of Ashmore. I started to research him and realized that I was able to find quite a bit about his life after emancipation, but also that I had already found some family documents that mentioned him in the time before emancipation while he was still enslaved. I put together a story of Toby's life and I started looking for descendants. In the meantime, I kept on looking. I was fortunate enough that kind people had indexed the Freedmen's Bank records, and through those records I was able to determine that of the 11 people enslaved by my family, 8 of them were a family. Sibby was their mother, and the other 7 were her children, including Toby Ashmore. As I researched, I became more and more frustrated at how difficult it was for their descendants to find them in the way that I had found my ancestors. I became particularly frustrated when I realized that the way I found my fourth great-grandfather's will was as an abstract in the 1964 issue of the Georgia Genealogical Magazine, edited by Judge Fulks Huxford. These abstracts, which were made of many probate records across courthouses in Georgia, included every single name mentioned in the record, because of course genealogists know how important names are, but they did not include the names of the enslaved people who were mentioned. Often they did not even mention that enslaved people were in the will or probate record. They only referred generically to property. In this case, there was a mention because there was an unusual codicil, but it gave no names. I thought that something must have been done about this, some way that these people's names had been added to the historical record. But I couldn't find anything, so I decided to do it myself. I took all the abstracts for all the wills from 1786 to 1824, and I found the original documents, which are all on Family Search and Ancestry, just not indexed. And I copied them and added back in the names of the enslaved people to make them available to their descendants. I decided to start a blog to get the information out there because I realized that a blog is essentially a simple database. Each post is a record, and once you put them all together into a blog, which is searchable, you have a searchable database. I chose the WordPress.com blog format because it's free, and being free, it stays online even if something happens to me. That blog has now grown into a website. A friend, Kathy Dillon, joined me a few months into the project, and she has been actively helping transcribe and abstract the records. This is what the website looks like today. We now have over 30,000 names of enslaved and free African Americans in Liberty County in documents that include all the wills from 1762 to 1865, all the estate inventories from the same time period, and deed records from 1831 through 1865. Those include marriage contracts, chattel mortgages, bills of sale, deeds of gift. I am still actively working on the deeds before 1831. We also have church records, including the records of the Midway Congregational Church that I mentioned. They kept records from 1752 through 1867, and those records have over 3,800 references to enslaved and free African Americans who were members of the church, but those records had never been published. I added a spreadsheet of all of those references. We've also added working aids and other records as we found them, as well as research guides. The latest project has been transcribing and researching the Southern Claims Commission records, which I'll talk more about in a little bit. The abstracts and transcriptions, such as the wills, estate inventories, and deeds, can be browsed. Here's an example of what the wills look like. If you click on each one, you can see the abstract of the original document with a link to the original document. Here are the deed records. The Southern Claims Commission records are being transcribed, each case file transcribed in full, and I'm researching the claimants to try to trace them back into slavery, find out who the slave owner was, and forward into their post-emancipation lives, find out about their families, whether they bought land, etc. The Midway Church records consisted of hundreds of pages of handwritten registers. This page is from the earliest record, showing that Scipio and Judy were the first black members of the church, admitted in 1756. Peg was admitted later that same year. To save descendants the pain of reading through all those records, I created a spreadsheet with all the references to African American members. This spreadsheet is sortable, so you can sort by the enslaver's name or by the member's name. Also created a guide to finding the online deed records in Family Search. All these deed records are available there, but they're not indexed. However, there were handwritten and typed indexes created by court officials, and those are part of the Family Search records and Ancestry. So I have a guide on the website to tell how to find the record that you're looking for. Having all these records together in one searchable blog allows the user to put in a particular name and pull up every single record that shows that name. So for example, if I put in Pulaski, I pull up that Pulaski Carter submitted a Southern Claims Commission petition. A Pulaski was used as collateral on a loan by these people. Pulaski, maybe the same, maybe not, was used as collateral here, and then a Pulaski was mentioned in Mary Bird's Southern Claims Commission. You can see that if you have a common name that you're researching, you will pull up a lot of records, but of course it is much easier than if you had to search individually, page through all the handwritten records to find that name. This kind of project could be taken on by any individual, small group or large group, and the return is enormous. The whole is so much more than the sum of its parts. Having all the documents that name enslaved people from a whole county in one searchable database allows descendants to trace complex relationships back through generations. In particular, this massive data allows descendants to trace the reason for surname choices at emancipation. The problem of identifying the slave owner still remains because, as we all know, it is difficult to get past the 1870 census without knowing the slave owner's name. However, having this searchable database allows the descendant to enter in the first name of the person and get all the possibilities to investigate, rather than each person having to read through the thousands and thousands of pages of handwritten documents. The documents are all online, at least for Liberty County. They were digitized in the 1950s by the Church of the Latter-day Saints, but they are not indexed for the most part, or if they are indexed, they're only indexed by the subject of the document, not the other people, such as enslaved people, who would be mentioned in it. So what kind of stories have we found through putting together all these documents? Let me first give a little history on Liberty County. Liberty County has been majority African American since slavery was legalized in the British province of Georgia in the 1750s, and a group of white rice planters moved to the Midway area in what became Liberty County after the Revolution, bringing with them about 3 times their number in enslaved people of African descent to create and work rice and cotton plantations. It was a very difficult environment, full of malaria and yellow fever and dangerous animals such as snakes and alligators. The work was back-breaking, as you can imagine. But one interesting factor about the difficulty of the environment was that the white families tended through the summer to migrate a little inland to higher ground and left the enslaved people on the plantations by themselves, often with only a single white overseer. With this isolation, they developed a unique culture known as the Geechee culture and were able to maintain many traditions believed to have come from their African origins. This has resulted in a lot of study of the area and a lot of documentation. My work necessarily has focused on the probate court and church records of the white planters that named the enslaved people. There was also a small community of free people who are also named in the records. I mentioned Toby Ashmore, who was enslaved by my family. His is one of the stories that developed through building this record set. I can now say that Toby was born around 1809, originally enslaved by John Ashmore, my 4th great-grandfather, as his mother, Sibby, was enslaved by John Ashmore. Toby was apparently given to John Ashmore's son, Joseph, my 3rd great-grandfather, upon his marriage, probably shortly after his birth. More on that later. In 1832, Toby was baptized into the membership of the Pleasant Grove Church, which was an offshoot of the Midway Congregational Church. That church was attended by my Ashmore ancestors as well. I have the records of the Pleasant Grove Church, and I have transcribed them and put them on the website. They include both the white and the black members. By 1846, when Reverend Charles Colcock Jones, a white planter, clergyman, and slave owner, conducted a census of all the African American church members in Liberty County's 15th district, and you can imagine what an amazing historical document that is. Toby was attending the North Newport Baptist Church, which is interesting because this census tells us that the enslaved people in Liberty County didn't necessarily attend the same church as their slave owners. In fact, I've found cases where the enslaver did not attend church at all, but their enslaved people did attend church. You can see here John Ashmore, and it lists Abram, Letha, Saul, Sandy, and Toby, and they attended different churches. I've converted that census into a sortable spreadsheet. It has over 1,100 names of people of African descent who attended church in 1846. Toby married at some point to Elizabeth, and in the 1870 census, they have 3 children. In 1877, Toby died, leaving 12 acres of land, a mule, and a wagon. By then, he had 5 children. Elizabeth, his wife, remarried to a much younger man, but kept the land in her own name and continued to pay taxes on it. Her daughter Caroline married a Schumann, and her daughter Agnes married a Jordan, and they lived in Liberty County until they all died in the 1920s. In early 1878, a member of my family wrote, "You knew our old daddy Toby, I think. Grandma raised him with her own children, and we all felt like another of the family was gone." The grandma she mentioned was Joseph Ashmore's wife. And I think you all know that I probably originally thought this was a nice thing, that perhaps my ancestors were the good slave owners. But I learned more of the story later on. An incredible story that has emerged from this mass of records is that of Shadrach Hargraves. A white merchant named Joseph Hargraves immigrated from Liverpool, England to Charleston, South Carolina. In the time-honored method, he became wealthy by marrying a wealthy widow who owned land and enslaved people in Liberty County, so he moved there. She died relatively quickly, and he stayed on. He was an elder of the Midway Congregational Church and actually a member of the board that decided on disciplinary actions for people who had transgressed their regulations, including adultery. In 1828, he died. His will stipulated that 1/4 of his estate should go to a young mulatto boy named Shadrach, and that $100 each was to be given to 2 enslaved women named Benna and Nanny. The other 3/4 of the estate was to go to his nephew, Joshua Hargraves, who lived in Liverpool, and he named a local planter called Thomas Mallard as his executor. Obviously, I thought this was very unusual, and I wondered what had happened to make Hargraves leave 1/4 of his estate to Shadrach. I considered the obvious, which was that Shadrach was his son, but I wondered how could I prove it? Well, in going through the Liberty County Superior records, which are all online but not indexed, I found the answer. It lay in the court case that Joshua Hargraves had filed against Thomas Mallard, the executor, because he suspected Mallard of cheating him, and he also did not want Shadrach to inherit. Annexed to the court case was the original will. It turned out that they had redacted the will that I found in the probate records to make it fit the laws of the time. In the original will, Hargraves acknowledged Shadrach as his son and Benna as Shadrach's mother. Nanny was her mother. Hargraves asked that Shadrach be sent to England to receive an English education, and he asked that Mallard act as Shadrach's guardian. Obviously, the white men were not going to allow this to happen. In the end, Shadrach did not inherit, but Mallard did send him to Liverpool, where he was received in some way into the Hargraves family. When Joshua Hargraves died, he left 2,000 pounds to Shadrach and acknowledged him as his uncle's natural son. Shadrach used the money to go into partnership with someone else to set up a brewery. Something else went wrong, and Shadrach ended up going to jail for fraud for about a year. When he got out, he married. He had a son whom he named Shadrach Binna Hargraves after his mother. Shadrach died in Liverpool, and unfortunately his son does not appear to have had children himself. I would have liked to have found descendants to give this story to. But can you imagine what it was like for that 13-year-old boy, Shadrach, when he was taken to Savannah, taken from his mother, put on a ship in the port of Savannah, and headed off to Liverpool, England? I can only imagine what it was like for him getting off that ship. As far as the family that was left behind, Binna and Nanny, they were apparently freed. Binna appears in the 1850 census and in the 1870 census. And I should mention that the research about Shadrach's life in Liverpool, England, came from a man who had originally researched the Hargraves family and had found Shadrach, but didn't know the backstory. So we were in contact and he gave me all that information. I mentioned the Southern Claims Commission project. Apparently, due to some enterprising lawyers, Liberty County had a large number of applicants under this program, which was for compensation for property that was taken by Union soldiers during the Civil War. In Liberty County's case, Sherman's army got to Savannah and sent out a raiding party headed by General Kilpatrick to Liberty County to forage for the army in December 1864. The soldiers took everything they could find from both rich and poor, white and black. A majority of the Liberty County claimants were actually freed people because Liberty County planters used to encourage their enslaved people to grow crops and raise stock for themselves after their daily tasks were done. I mean, this saved the planters the trouble of doing it themselves or directing people to do it. One of the claimants was Tony Axon, who was a free black man working as a blacksmith when the soldiers came. As part of his claim, Tony testified, "I was rejoiced when I first heard of the war, and I said, thank God, so that my wife and daughter could have the same privilege as I had." He was married to an enslaved woman, and he shared his time between his home and his blacksmith shop in town and the home that he shared with her on her slaveholder's plantation. Tony's wife's owner testified for him, saying he was an honest, upright man, and so regarded by the community, where he was well known from his childhood. He did business just as any other white mechanic did and earned his pay for it just the same. His credit was good and he was quite reliable. Tony also testified about his mother. He said her name was Binna Holmes and that she had belonged to Joseph Hargraves, who had freed her. Yes, Binna was Shadrach's mother and Tony was his brother. Tony became free when Binna was freed, as the child's status comes from the mother, of course. Tony Axon evidently had standing within the local community, having been a free man most of his life and being well regarded by his white neighbors. On November 28, 1865, he was one of several signatories to a letter to the Freedmen's Bureau Subassistant Commissioner in Savannah, appealing for assistance. They had been instructed to sign labor contracts with their former employers, but were being refused care for their children and elderly relatives. The letter also said that there were some people remaining on the plantations who did not know yet that they were free. It said, "We are a working class of people and we are willing and desirous to work for a fair compensation, but to return to work upon the terms that are at present offered to us would be, we think, going back into the state of slavery that we have just to some extent been delivered from." These records can also be an answer to surprising DNA results. In 1789, John Goulding, a Liberty County planter, slave owner, and Revolutionary War soldier, and a member of the Midway Congregational Church, wrote his will. He wanted 5 named enslaved children set free when they became 25, and if his heirs were to die before he became 21, then those 5 freed people were to inherit the entire estate, including the other enslaved people. Why? Was he just a good man? Apparently not. In 1770, the Midway Church records tell us that John Goulding was expelled from the Midway Church for suspicion of keeping his own wench and adultery with another man's wife. The other man's wife was probably the enslaved woman, as enslaved marriages were recognized in the Midway Church. I talked about how having a large record set from a particular county can help in tracing the reasons for adoption of a particular surname at emancipation. What did I mean? In Liberty County, many freed people, if not most, didn't adopt their last enslaver's surname. I was told, and I found it to be true in my research, that many people adopted the surname of an early enslaver of their family, almost like providing a family tree. One of the more unusual cases where I found this was for Pulaski Carter. You saw his records before when I showed the search screen, who submitted a Southern Claims petition as well. He testified in the petition that his last enslaver was Alexander Quarterman. Fortunately, Pulaski's a somewhat unusual first name, so when I searched the They Had Names database, I found that Alexander had inherited Pulaski from his father, Thomas Quarterman, in 1858. So why did Pulaski take the surname Carter? Usually I would look to find if a woman with that surname had married into the family, as she might have brought enslaved people into the marriage. In this case, I didn't find that. Instead, in May 1840, a Sarah Amanda Mara sold Pulaski to Thomas W. Quarterman, and then Thomas W. Quarterman transferred title to him to Thomas Quarterman in the same year. So we know how he got to Thomas Quarterman, but still nothing about Carter. In 1819, Louis McTair, a tailor, left a Pulaski to Sarah Amanda's father, and Sarah inherited Pulaski from her father. McTair also left $400 to John Carter, the son of his friend Hepworth Carter. So now it seems like we're getting closer. At least a Carter has entered the picture, though it's still not clear why Pulaski would have taken that surname. So I looked at Hepworth Carter. In 1791, he had money problems, and part of his property, including unnamed enslaved people, was sold off. Then in 1812, he directed in his will that his remaining enslaved people be sold and the proceeds divided among his children. So there were no names of enslaved people in these documents, but it's very likely that Pulaski's mother was among them and that McTair had purchased her. So at emancipation, Pulaski reached back into his family's history and he took that name. The document sets can also be used to tell the true story of the enslaving families. I've been hearing the phrase "history is history" recently from people who fear that their family stories will be changed by the new facts that are coming out. In truth, though, all we're doing is telling the whole story. Recently, I was reading about William McWhirr, a middle-class Irish clergyman and teacher who moved to America after the Revolution. He took up a position teaching in an academy where George Washington's nephews went to school in Virginia. McWhirr knew Washington, they exchanged letters, and he had dinner at Washington's house. Then McWhirr moved to the Georgia coast in 1793 to take up a position as headmaster at Liberty County's Sunbury Academy. He was also a Presbyterian minister there. At his death in 1851, he was considered one of the foremost educators in Georgia. He was a founding member of the Georgia Historical Society. Everything I read about his life sounded like he had done well financially from his teaching income and was able to buy a plantation. No, in fact, he used the time-honored method of marrying a rich widow. She was a Revolutionary War patriot's widow and had a plantation. None of the sources mentioned the truth about the reason for his financial well-being. He owned people. The records show that he owned at least 20 enslaved people by name, and that he sold them in 1839 for $8,000 and lived off the proceeds for the rest of his life. In 1846, in fact, he traded a young enslaved man named Bounty to a planter named Charlton Hines in return for the use of Daniel, an enslaved man about 22 years old, to act as his servant for his lifetime. When McWhirr died, Daniel actually went back to the Hines estate, and I was able to trace him through the end of the Civil War. McWhirr was known to his students as a strict disciplinarian who used his cane liberally. His cane, which he brought with him from Ireland, can still be seen at the Midway Museum in Liberty County. The daughter of one of his former students remembered that she and her brother would flee every time they saw McWhirr coming down the lane to their house with Daniel because he was so unpleasant. If he was that way to the children of elite white planters, what must he have been like to people who were in his complete control? So I mentioned, going back to Toby Ashmore, that I was trying to find his descendants in order to give them the information I had found about him after discovering that he was enslaved by my ancestors. I've found that the best way to do that is to look for other ancestry members who have the person I'm looking for in their tree, since Toby Ashmore's descendants could find him back to the 1870 census as easily as I could. I found several members, ancestry members, and I wrote to them. This is one of the notes. Charlie Jordan, who is Toby Ashmore's second great-grandson, wrote back. Toby's daughter Agnes had married Richard Jordan. The family eventually moved to Florida, where Charlie lives, and some time ago he began searching for his family history just like I was. We exchanged information and we became Facebook friends, and then we finally met in person. This photo is actually from a second meeting at the Midway First Presbyterian Church, just up the way from the Midway Congregational Church that my ancestors attended, and not far from the First African Baptist Church that Toby attended. That was the North Newport Baptist Church that was in the records. It became the First African Baptist Church. At our earlier meeting, Charlie gave me access to his DNA. I had already checked to see if I or any of my family kits that I managed matched him, but they didn't. After he gave me the access, I checked my first cousin once removed's DNA, which I don't manage, and there it was. I can't help but feel that this biological relationship was at least a partial explanation of why I have felt so compelled to start and continue this project. And I am so grateful to have found new family. I hope I've shown how many different kinds of stories can come out of a project like this. And what I like best is that it allows the descendants to find the stories for themselves. I'm no expert, but I would be happy to share what I've learned about how to create a project like this, the good, the bad, the ugly, things I'm happy I did and things I wish I hadn't done. I'll show my contact information in a moment, but while I'm here, I'd like to also put in a plug for visiting Liberty County when that's safe again. It's a remarkable place, very historic. You could visit the historic Dorchester Academy. I've got its website here. It has an African American museum. It shows the incredible linkage of Liberty County with the Civil Rights Movement, and also the history of the resilient Liberty County African American community. The Susie King Taylor Institute celebrates the history of Liberty County native Susie King Taylor, who was a Civil War nurse and the only woman of color to write a memoir of the Civil War. The Institute's executive director, Hermina Glass Hill, is a public historian who moved from Atlanta to Liberty County to set up the Institute and to tell Susie's story. It's just incredible. The Sankofa Driving Trail of Eastern Liberty County provides a driving tour of 14 historic African American sites in Eastern Liberty County. And the Geechee Kunda Cultural Arts Center is filled with unique African and African American artifacts. The Midway Museum next to the church tells the story of the planters who founded the church, and the website of the Liberty County Historical Society, which is now headed by a Black woman, Hermina Glass Hill, for the first time, is very useful as well. Thank you for your time. I hope this presentation will lead someone or some group to consider a similar project. Feel free to contact me if you think I can help.